So today what we're going to be doing is I'm just going to be walking you guys through how to build a basic lexical decision task in ePrime. For those of you who have followed our Getting Started guide or our reference guide or anything like that, this is going to look pretty familiar to you guys. It's just a very basic experiment. It'll be highlighting some of the new features of ePrime 3. So that's kind of the focus of today's webinar. If you guys have any questions, please feel free to live chat me. I'm always happy to answer any questions you guys have. The more back and forth in these kind of things, especially because it's a live event, the better off that, the better it is. I always love handling questions from you guys, and I kind of love that audience back and forth. So feel free to shoot me a question if you guys have any of them at all, especially during the webinar. If you need me to repeat something, if you would like me to, if you want to explore an additional functionality in ePrime, if you see a tab or a setting that might be new and you want me to elaborate on it a little more, give me a shout out. I'm always happy to answer a question. So we have ePrime 3.0 open right here. The first thing that you guys are going to notice is that our templates are a little different. So if you're used to ePrime 2, you're used to basic and blank. And what that does is blank will open up at a completely blank instance of eStudio, kind of like what you have here. It's kind of a blank template on which to write on. Our basic will open up just kind of a basic lexical decision task, a little bit like what we're going to be working through today, but a little different, a little simpler. It doesn't necessarily show off any of the new features of ePrime 3, but it does a really good job of just getting you a starting point if you need any sort of basic experiment structure. It's a good place to start. What our block counterbalance does is it shows you a counterbalanced experiment by block. So if you have different groups of participants that are running different blocks of ePrime, it'll set that up for you already. We have a nested list template, so if you need to do any sort of nested lists for any sort of randomization, you can actually just open up that template and it'll be right there for you. And our other one is open response. So if you have participants who are responding to a lot of different stimuli, or if they're going to be writing sort of an essay, or they're responding in kind of long form format, this is going to kind of be the best template for you. For this instance, since we'll be building the experiment from scratch to show you the different parts of ePrime, more specifically eStudio, we're going to start with the base, or just a blank template. So I'll go ahead. If you guys want to follow along during this, please feel free. I'm going to kind of walk everybody step by step here, so it might be a little slow going. If you want me to speed up, I'm always happy to speed up. Otherwise, I'll be kind of walking, through step by step here just to show you guys if you guys want to follow along as well. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK for the blank template. It'll take just about a second to load up a blank template here. All the templates take a couple seconds just to load up. It's not a problem at all. So for those of you who are new to ePrime 3, you're going to notice a couple of new features, especially if you used ePrime 2 before. Primarily, you're going to notice here at the very bottom of the window that our Advisor tab and our Output tab are now two different windows. That's just an aesthetic thing. Feel free to get rid of these if you'd like. I'm actually going to get rid of the Experiment Advisor tab for the purpose of this live stream here. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to show or collect some demographic data from participants. This is going to do a pretty good job of demonstrating some of the newer features that we have in ePrime. Primarily the button object and the survey object, or the slide choice object more specifically. So what I want to do is I want to present participants with a screen that just says, hey, we're going to be showing some demographic information, and then just go ahead and click a button on the screen to move on to collect the demographic information. That's going to kind of be the first part of the experiment that we show participants. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to double click on my session proc. So the session proc in ePrime, for those of you not familiar, is basically a timeline of events in your experiment. ePrime is laid out in a very visual format, so everything that's going to be at the very beginning of your experiment will obviously be on the left-hand side of the screen next to this little green button here, and everything that'll be shown at the end of your experiment will be on the right-hand side of the screen at this red button here. So the first thing we're going to do is I'm actually going to put a slide down. So what a slide object is in ePrime is a slide object could be any mixture of stimuli. So if you have multiple stimuli you want to show to participants, if you want to display a button, for example, that it would be something you do on a slide object. If you want to show images, if you want to show a video with text or a video with audio cues or anything like that, you would want to use a slide object. It's easiest thought of as like a PowerPoint slide, basically. So to add one to your experiment, just grab it from the toolbox and go ahead and drag it and drop it into your experimental timeline. As you see there, it shows up on the far left-hand side of the screen next to the beginning parts of my experiment. Right now it's just called slide 1. That's the default slide name for anything in ePrime. I actually want to change this. I have kind of embarrassing stories from when I was an undergrad working with ePrime. And I used to just keep all of ePrime's default names, and I would have all of these charts and graphs that would show me what each slide would do. And it actually took me a really long time to even look at my data once I collected it, because I'd be like, okay, what was the purpose of slide 1? What was the purpose of slide 2? And there's actually a really easy way to get around that I didn't know when I was an undergraduate, so don't be like me. What I recommend is always changing the name of the slide object to reflect its functionality. So in this instance, it's going to be an instructions screen that will let participants know about the demographic information that we'll be collecting very soon. So I am going to rename this Demo Instructions. Whoops. Now I just changed the name there just by clicking on it once and clicking F2. You can also rename it. Oh, did we?
So F2 is a hotkey for our other software. So we're gonna pull back Ephraim real quick. There we go.
Hey guys, sorry about that. Did not know F2 is a hotkey. So again, growing pains. Thanks for bearing with us. So I will not be using the F2 hotkey anymore. I will be doing it the long way. To do that, just right-click on the object and click Rename, which you can see here is F2 for those of you who aren't streaming right now. So I just renamed it Demo Instructions, just so participants know what it's doing. And if you click here on the session proc, you can see it now in our Experiment Explorer under the Structure tab. So if you double-click on Demo Instructions, it'll open it up in what we call eStudio's workspace. For those of you who are new to ePrime 3 but familiar with ePrime 2, you're going to notice that there's a way different layout to our slide objects now. All the objects aren't in the top anymore, they're actually on the side. And some of them are going to look familiar. I'll run through them quickly. A text display object that's used, or a slide text object that's used for presenting text on your slide. A slide image object that's used for presenting images on your slide. Similarly, a slide video is used for presenting videos or movies. The other objects that should look familiar are the slide sound out and the slide sound in. The slide sound out is used for playing audio to participants, and the slide sound in is used for recording audio. So if you want participants to speak at any point during the slide object and to collect that data, that's how you would do that. The ones that are going to look new for people are this object here. It's called a slide button. This is an easy way to create a slide or a clickable button on your slide object. I'm going to be demonstrating that one in this slide in just a minute. The next one I'm going to be demonstrating too is also called a slide choice. It's basically our survey object. This is how you would just make basically a multiple choice or a Likert type scale in the middle of a slide object. And then the last one is a slide slider. Our slide sliders are basically a fully functional slider, no script necessary, and that'll be added at the very end of the experiment for those of you who are going to be staying that long. So the first thing I want to do is I want to give instructions to participants just to let them know that very soon we'll be collecting demographic information, that they're supposed to click a button on the screen to advance the slide. So the first thing I would do is add a slide text. So go ahead and click on the slide text and click anywhere in the E object. It doesn't really matter. I'll click down here just for fun. To edit the text of an E object, go ahead and double click on it, and it'll just kind of show it in blue, and then just type the text that you want. It's going to look a little smushed and cut off, but we'll fix it later, trust me. So I am going to type, welcome to the experiment. For those of you new to ePrime 3 but familiar with ePrime 2, our default font has changed. I like this one much better, by the way. We will be collecting some basic information about your ePrime use. Click continue to begin. Let me spell begin correctly. All right, so now that I have all of that information or all the text that I want on that slide object, I don't like where it is, I don't like how it looks terrible. So to change it, all I have to do is drag and drop it to where I actually want it to appear, in this instance at the very top of the screen, and I'll resize it. So I'm going to resize it to about here. Now right now, it looks like it's all kind of smushed together at the top. That's literally just for design time. If I double click on it, all of those like enters that I put, or all those character returns that I put in, those are actually going to show up. So it's going to look more like this when I run the slide. And I actually kind of like the way this looks, so I'm going to keep it like this. So now if you notice, my instructions say click continue to begin. So what I have to do then is make a slide button. So to do that, let's go ahead and click on the slide button object. And I want my slide button to be just in the bottom right hand corner. So I'm going to put it right there, next to the restart required screen I just got. All right, so now that I have the button up, I want to change some of the properties, because right now it just says button, it doesn't say continue. But the benefit of this is it is already a fully clickable button in ePrime. So if I even run the experiment from now, anytime I take my mouse and hover it over top, it's going to change to look like a button hover. anytime I click on it, it's going to look like it's being clicked. It's not going to do anything because I haven't specified it to do anything yet, but it is going to have all of the visual cues of a fully functional button in E', and all I did was just drag and drop an object. So that's pretty cool. To change the properties of this object, I'm going to go ahead and click on this Sub-Object Properties Page button. The Sub-Object Properties Page button basically works with any sub-object that's in this window right here. So if I drop this down, I can change the properties of the slide text object by clicking on this and clicking this button. But in this instance, I just want the button, so I'll click on this. Now, there are a couple things to go over about the button properties that I do kind of want to go over quickly. This is going to be a little more dense and not as hands-on right now, but this is kind of important stuff to know. The first one's the name of the button. This is what's going to be returned when they click on it. Right now, button 1 doesn't tell me much. It just tells me that they clicked any button on screen, so I'm actually going to change this from button 1 to continue. As far as response is concerned, response is how the resp value or the response property is going to show up in your data file. Right now, when they click on this button, your data file is going to show the word continue in little squiggly brackets like that. For most people, that's completely fine. For more complex designs, people might want, for example, a 1 to show up as the response, or they might want the word next or something like that. For our instances, the name is completely fine to use as the response. So we'll keep going. As far as the frame is concerned, this is just how you resize and reposition the button. I actually like where it is on the slide object, so I'm going to keep it right there. And probably the most involved tab that we have for buttons is the theme tab. If you notice, there's kind of a lot of things to change about this. The first one is the style. So this is what you change what the button looks like, basically. And we have something called circumstances. What circumstances are the different button states. So, for example, what does the button do or look like when it's just sitting on the screen doing nothing, or in our instances, normal? If I want to change what it looks like if I hover over top of it, if I change what it looks like when I click on it, with a little checked, or with a hover, or with a down, or anything like that, any possible mixture of properties that I could interact with this button, you can change what it does and how it interacts. In this instance, I'm just going to change normal, and I want to change the text on it, because right now it says button. I told participants, hey, go ahead and click continue. There's no continue on the screen. So I'm going to change text from button to continue. And what that's going to do, if I go ahead and click apply, you're going to see that my button now says the word continue on it. And it's a little smushed. So we'll hop back over to the frame tab, and we can change the width from 10%. Let's say we'll make it 15% and see how that goes. And that looks much better. So we'll go ahead and keep it like that. If I want to, I can change what happens when I click on it. So if I want it to, let's say, turn green when I click on it, I would go to circumstance, and then I would go to down, for instance, and then I could change the text from continue when it's down to, like, I pressed the button, or something like that, just to give participants visual feedback that they actually pressed the button. But in this instance, I just want to keep it at continue, because there doesn't need to be a change in words or anything like that, not for this part of the paradigm. So I'm going to go ahead and click apply and OK, because this is exactly the change that I needed. So now all I really need to do is change some of the duration input properties of this, because right now this is all at E''s defaults. And E''s default for a slide object is to keep it on screen for exactly 1 second or 1,000 milliseconds. And that is way too fast for this, and I want participants to actively press the button that I just spent so much time making. So I'll go ahead and click on this properties pages icon. I'll click on the duration input tab right here. And I want to change the duration from 1 second, like I mentioned before, to infinite. What this is going to do is it'll leave the slide up for an infinite amount of time. So it'll be on the screen literally until participants press a button or we shut off the computer. So since I want them to interact with this button, I'm going to add an input mask. What an input mask is in E' is it's just a way to interact with a slide object. So it's like me saying, through what method am I going to have participants respond to this object? And in this instance, I want to have them respond with a button. So I'll have them double click on the button. And if I look here, it adds a button object. And this allowable by default just means any click. So any click to this button is going to count as a response to this button, and it's going to move on. And that's exactly what I want. So I'm going to keep that like that. I'm going to change data logging from none to standard. What this is going to do is just going to log some of the basic values, and I'll show you those values in a second, but I do like to keep data logging on, and this is where I kind of jump into that another story that I like to tell about my horror days as an undergraduate with E'. as an undergraduate with ePrime, I made my senior thesis using ePrime, and I ended up collecting 15 to 16 participants worth of data without any data logging turned on. It was a lot of time, it was a lot of money, and it was a lot of embarrassment. Please don't do that. Please don't be me. I recommend turning data logging on for any object, even ones that you don't think are absolutely necessary, just because I always say that more data and having data that you don't need but can reference later is better than having data that, not logging data and wishing you had it later on down the road. So at minimum, I recommend changing data logging to time audit only, just so you can get the timestamp of when that object appeared on the screen and when it appeared off the screen. But if you really want to go for it, I say just keep data logging at standard. So I'm going to click apply to keep those changes. Now I'm going to show you exactly what we're logging when I say standard data logging. So let's click on the logging tab, and all of the checked boxes here is what ePrime is going to be automatically logging. And you can see that there's a lot that we're not, but that's okay. What it is logging right now is accuracy, what the correct response is, what the actual response was. So in this instance, it's going to be that continue button. RT, so what the difference is, what RT is the difference between when the object appeared on the screen and when the participant pressed the button. So how long were they looking at this? That's going to be my RT value. RT time, what RT time is the difference between the very beginning of the experiment and when the participant pressed a button on this object. Since this is the first object, it's not going to be very different from RT value, but this is going to start to compound, obviously, as the experiment grows and grows and grows. We're going to get duration error. So was there an error with the duration? This is basically a yes or no kind of thing. Onset delay. So how long is the difference between when an object was supposed to appear on the screen and when it did appear on the screen? And onset time, which is a timestamp of in milliseconds of when the object appears on the screen. And onset to onset time is, in ePrime, the most accurate measurement of how long the object was on screen at all. So the onset of this object to the onset of the next object on the screen. That's always a really useful one to log, and that's logged by default in the time audit properties, which is why I say it's always nice to have. All right, so those are the only properties we need to change there, so I'm going to go ahead and click OK to continue. So now that we have our demographic instructions already done, because I don't need to do anything else to this, I want to actually collect the demographic information. So I'm going to go double click on the session proc again so I can see my experimental timeline, and I'm going to add another slide object to this. So I'll take a slide object and I'll add it just after this. Again, its default name is slide 1. I'm going to rename this and this time not crash the stream. And I will rename this one just to demo collect. So I'm collecting the demographic information here. I'll double click on it to open it up in eStudio's window. If you notice, what I'll be doing here, or what's happening when I open these tabs, is that, or when I open up a new object in ePrime, we now have tabs at the top of the window here. It's just an easier way to kind of work through all of the different open objects that you have. You can also put it back to ePrime's classic window mode if you do window and then click cascade. For those of you who are used to ePrime 2, this is the view that you're most used to seeing. I personally kind of like the tabs at the top. It allows me to kind of work through all of these things pretty quickly. So now that I have my demo slide up, or my demo collect slide up, I want to have, for participants, I would like to have a series of choices that they can make. I want to ask participants what ePrime experiments they've already run or what experiments they've made in ePrime already, and I would like them to just click on whichever ones they've made and continue. And that's pretty easy to do in ePrime. To do that, all you would do is we use one of our new features called Slide Layout Templates. Now, if you click on this button, what you're going to see is a bunch of different possible layouts for slides. What this does is it helps you get from design time to experiment creation much faster. Especially if you're like me, I'm kind of a perfectionist when things are appearing on screen in ePrime, and I really like things to look precise. And I like them to look really good on screen, just so like things aren't sloppy or things aren't misaligned. And what ended up happening in ePrime 2 is I'd end up spending more time kind of arranging things on the screen than I would actually making my experiment. And that was just a pain. So what we've done is we have these basically pre-rendered slides for you guys. And they rate anywhere from a 5-item single selection, which is what we're going to be using today, to a Likert type rating scale that responds to either text or an image, or scale to movie. Or we have just different slider options as well. And we also have things that are made specifically for touchscreens, so an on-screen keyboard, an on-screen number pad, a circle layout. That it really is one of the bigger features of ePrime 3 is that it is now more compatible with touchscreens, especially through the use of the button object. And we also have some DPI scaling too that we do, which I can totally get in later if you guys would like more information on that. But for now, since I just want participants to make a simple, just checklist of what they've done, I am going to click on the 5-item single selection slide layout template. If you click on it, it's going to ask, are you sure you want to add the slide layout template or SLT? I'm going to click yes, and it's going to take about a second because it does a lot behind the scenes. What it does, I'm going to click OK because it just got added. What it does is it adds 3 text display objects, my survey header, a question instructions, and then a question prompt. So what do I do? It added a button object. It added what we call a slide choice object, which could have been added just by clicking on this slide choice sub-object there and then clicking in there. That totally would have worked. Another way to do that is just do the slide layout template. I think it's much faster and much easier. Now all I really have to do then is fill in all of these, basically these fake headers. So for survey header, I'm just going to type demographic information. This is just a sample experiment. I wouldn't recommend actually giving this to a participant, obviously, but just in this instance, it's just for demographic information. For question instruction, I'm actually just going to say select as many as possible or as applicable. Press next when finished. And then my question prompt is going to be how many of these paradigms have you made with ePrime? Again, not handy demographic information for real psychological studies, but fun for the webinar. So now all I have to do is change these items. And if you also notice, to the left here, I have radio buttons that that are going to be used to only select one of them, and this says select as many as applicable. So I want to change that. To do that, all I do is click on the slide sub-object properties page here. Again, it'll go with any slide sub-object that I have in this window. In this instance, I'm just going to do choice 1, so I will click on this. Now, the label in this instance is going to be what appears to participants. Right now, it just says item 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Obviously, I want to change that. So I'm just going to change it to the names of a few common paradigms that I've seen people use in ePrime. So, Stroop. Lexical Decision. IAT. Auditory Oddball, and Tower of London, or Tower of Hanoi. So now if I click apply and OK, if you look here, now my options are going to be the actual options that I want. And I'm going to resize these. Oh, and I also should spell of better. I noticed I spelled it or. There we go. Tower of London. And it looks much better now. Now, the only other thing that I want to change to is I said they should select all or as many as applicable. And right now, since I have a radio button, it's only going to let me select one at a time, which isn't ideal. So I'm going to jump back into the slide choice properties page here. And there's this property here called single selection. I want to change single selection from yes to no. And what that's going to do to my slide choice is it's actually now going to make it a checkbox. So now it's going to be a series of checks. So, however many they want to check, and that's going to count as our response to this particular slide object. Now, the one thing I do want to point out about adding a slide layout template, and this is kind of cool, is if you click on the properties page and go to the duration input tab, you'll see that it already sets this up for you. It sets a duration to infinite. It says that I have a next button I want to click. And if you look at the general tab, we have this input source property. Now, this input source property is going to change the name or the data that I get from just collecting information about the button object, and it's actually going to make the information about now the choice object. So in this instance, what they clicked here. So now the accuracy, reaction time, and response values are now going to all be in relation to that slide choice sub-object that we have, and not necessarily to that next button, which honestly doesn't matter. What's more important is what they select and how many of them they select, not whether they click the next button or not. And if you look in this logging tab here, you'll see that we also have a new set of data properties that we can log for the slide choice object. So choice1.accuracy, change count, so how many times the participants change what they want on there. We have the RT, so just the reaction time, the RT time, response count, how many times did they respond? I actually want that checked. The value, and it logs all of that by default if you select that slide layout template. So honestly, it's just a really nice feature because not only does it set up the visual component of your slide object, it also kind of sets up the nitty-gritty stuff behind the scenes too, which is really good for participants or for users of ePrime who are pretty new and just want to get off the ground as soon as possible. You don't have to learn about how all of these different properties interact with each other. You just have to learn how the slide layout templates work, and then you can start running with your experiment as soon as possible. So I'm going to click Apply and OK to save these changes, and that's really all I need to do to this demographic information slide. And now have everything that I want here. One thing that is bugging me though, and I will be honest, lexical decision, the L is not capitalized, so I'm going to change that. There we go. Thank you guys for bearing with me. One thing I do want to recommend though about ePrime is to save as frequently as possible. I noticed that I've been kind of going on this webinar for a while, or this live stream for a while, and haven't saved yet. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'm going to click Save. And in this instance, I'm just going to save it to the desktop, and it's just going to be called base lexical decision.es3, and I'm going to save that there. And now I have everything saved. So I just recommend doing that as often as possible, just, in case somebody comes in, trips on the power cord, you didn't lose that much data. The one thing I do want to tell you guys, though, about is every time you click save in your experiment or you run an experiment, what ePrime does is it actually automatically generates a backup file or a backup version of your experiment for you. You can find this property by clicking on the experiment object in ePrime. I'm sorry, if you click on the tools and then properties window, or tools and options, if you look here, there's an option that by default is selected. It's called Experiment Backup. And what Experiment Backup does is every time you save an experiment, it keeps a backup version of your experiment in ePrime's little log file. And in your little log file there, it basically just saves, I think it's your 25 most recent files. So if for whatever reason you do find that, my IT department re-imaged my computer and I can't find it, you can actually just do your backup desktop or backup experiment. It's going to make a folder on your desktop of your 25 most recent, and you can just get them that way. All right. So now that we have collected our demographic data, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to have basic information for participants on the actual task itself. So in this instance, I really only need to collect text for participants. So in this instance, I'm just going to show you guys how a text display works. To do that, I'm going to take it from the toolbox and drag it in my experimental timeline so it comes after my demo collect. And again, I'm going to rename this from text display 1 to, it's just going to be instructions. Go ahead and double click on it to open it up in eStudio's workspace. Again, it is now a clickable tab. I'm going to get rid of some of the tabs up here just to keep things nice and neat. And I'm just going to give participants basic instructions on the task ahead. So it's a basic lexical decision task. If they see a word, I want them to click 1. If they see a non-word, I want them to click 2. So I'll write that out. I'm also going to thank them for the demographic information. Oops. Press 1. Whoops, press 2. I'm also going to make stimulus non-plural here. There we go. And then I'm going to have them press spacebar to continue. There we go. Very cool. So this is just my simple instructions to participants. Thank you very much for the demographic information. Now you will be presented with a fixation followed by a stimuli. If the stimulus is a word, press 1. If the stimulus is a non-word, press 2. Pretty simple instructions. I lay out the key mapping to participants, and I have them press space to continue. Now, similarly to a slide object, I want to change the duration input properties of this. A, to make sure that participants have read this, so it's on the screen indefinitely until the participants press space. And B, I want to make sure they actually have, or they're actually able to press space to move on. So to do that, I'm going to go ahead and click on the properties page, click on the duration input tab here, and for duration, I'm going to set that from 1000 to infinite. I'm going to add a keyboard input mask, and I'm going to set my allowable from any to space. Now, for those of you new to ePrime, if you want to press the space bar, this is how you would notate it in ePrime's allowable response. A little dissimilarly, if you want participants to respond with a number or letter, all you have to do is just type that number or letter in there. So if you want them to respond with A, B, or C, just do A, B, C. If you want to respond with 1, 2, or 3, just do 1, 2, 3. But for special characters like space bar or the up arrow or the delete button or backspace button, we have very special naming schemes for these things. And this is how we reference the space bar. And then just to kind of go along with the advice I gave later to not be my past college self, go ahead and change data logging from none to time audit only. And then go ahead and click apply and OK when you're done. Apply, if you just go to the logging tab here, you'll see that it logs the duration error, onset delay, onset time, and onset to onset time. That's perfect. And go ahead and click OK to continue. So that's really all we need here. We have this screen showing up indefinitely. We have the space bar to begin, and we are logging data. So we can go ahead and start doing the actual task. Now, this part's going to look a little confusing to those of you who are new to ePrime. What I'm going to do is I'm going to set up a block and then a trial. And it's going to make a little less sense at first, and then I'll start actually adding things to the experiment, and it's going to make way more sense, I promise. So in order to make a block in ePrime, what we consider a block is just a set of trials. So a set of things that the participants are going to run, because eventually I'm going to have a practice procedure and an actual critical procedure. You need a list object. A list object in ePrime is a place where you can actually log you can put down all of the variables that you're going to change in your experiments. All the independent variables that you want to change, they actually go into a list object. So I'm going to take a list object and I'm going to put it just after instructions. Again, it's called list1. I'm going to change this to block list because it is technically my block level list object. Where I'm getting these names, the whole block and trial kind of concept, can actually be found in ePrime's data structure. So if you double click on the experiment object and you click on data file, ePrime has this hierarchy here. And this is what ePrime's kind of expecting when it comes to how your experiment is functioning. So the topmost level here is called session. And what this is your entire experiment session. So when the participant sits down to when they stand up and are completely done with ePrime, that is considered one session. A block is considered a group of similar trials or a group of similarly typed stimuli. In this instance, one of my blocks is going to be a practice block of trials, and my other block is going to be a critical block of trials. That's how I'm going to kind of chunk these things up. Sorry, English was hard. The last thing that we have that I'm going to focus on today, I'm not going to get into sub-trial or log level kind of things. I'm just going to stop at trial. Trial is, I like to think of it as like the day-to-day. So it's exactly what our participants seeing, exactly what they're responding to, those kinds of things. So the trial is where my fixation object that I talked about in my instructions is going to appear. And that's also where my stimulus object is going to appear as well. So I have this session. It's already here. It's even called session proc by default in ePrime. I need to make this block level. So to do that, I would go into my block list, and I want to make a new procedure. We do have a procedure object in the toolbox here, but the easiest way, it's down here, the easiest way to make a new procedure in ePrime is actually just to type it in this procedure column. So I'll go ahead and make block proc and hit enter. And it'll say, it didn't exist, would you like to create it? I click yes, and then it'll say, would you like to make this the default value for newly created levels? I'm going to say yes. It doesn't matter because there's only one level here. But now, if you look at our experiment procedure or structure here, you're going to see that I have my session level and my block level. And it's even arranged in the same sort of indented hierarchy that my data file tab is here. And this is ideal. And what this is basically going to do for me is it's going to make my data come out much, much, much cleaner. It's going to make it so instead of having all of my data just kind of logged on one line, it'll make it so it's all in one column, basically. So all of the important data that I'm looking for is just going to be in one column, which is something that, for those of you who are using other software like SPSS to analyze your data. It's just going to make it convert much nicer, and it's going to put it in a format that you actually understand instead of having to kind of scroll through this really long list and pick what things you think are going to be important. I have many horror stories about improperly structured experiments and me taking 6 hours just to structure the data file so it looks like it's to a point where we can even clean it. Again, don't be me. Structure experiments like this. So in the block proc, it's not really going to do much right now because, like I said, eventually I want it to add a series of practice trials to the experiment. But for now, I'm just going to work on the main trial and we'll add the practice later because it's actually much easier and faster than you think it is. So all I'm going to do is, if I look here, you can see that now I need to make my trial level. I just need to do the exact same thing. I need to make a list object. I'm going to rename this one to trial list. And I'm going to change the procedure to trial proc. And hit enter. I'm going to get the same series of prompts. Doesn't exist. Would you like to create it? I'm going to click yes. And would I like to make this a default value for all my newly created levels? Again, I'm going to click yes. And now, if you take a look here, I have session, block, and trial, and that looks identical to my data file here, session, block, and trial. For those of you new to ePrime, this concept is a little confusing at first. Honestly, the easiest way to understand this concept is to mess it up a few times, and then once you start structuring your experiment like this, you're going to understand that, hey, this is so much better, and my data file just looks so much cleaner, and it's easier to use this way. I do recommend, this is, the PST recommended structure for the experiment, and I personally recommend it because of how many times I messed this up as an undergrad. So what I'm going to do to my trial list now is I'm actually going to make my independent variables that are going to change in my experiment. I had mentioned in my instructions here, I'm going to jump back and forth just to kind of show you guys. You don't have to be jumping back and forth with me, I promise. I mentioned here that they're going to see stimuli. Some of them will be words and some of them will be non-words. So that's going to change per trial, obviously. One trial will be presented with a word, another trial will be presented with a non-word, and so on and so forth. So I actually want to add that to my list object because this is, like I said, where we kind of change our independent variables or define them. So I'm going to add an attribute. I'm going to call this one stimuli. What adding an attribute in a list object does is it not only creates a column in the list object, but it creates a column that's able to be referenced at any point underneath it in the experimental timeline. So for example, at this point we have our trial list here. Anything below the trial list is something that we can actually reference in the experimental timeline. So anything below this will look up at trial list and we'll be able to see, oh hey, I have this object or I can see this thing. So it's pretty useful. So there's my stimuli. In this very simple sample experiment, I'm just going to present 6 stimuli to participants. I understand that's not a real psychological study, but just for the sake of YouTube and for doing this quickly. So what I can do to add more levels to this or add more possible stimuli to participants is I'm going to click Add Level. As you can see, I can now put 2 stimuli. You can also add multiple instead of just 1. If you add multiple here, I would like 6 total. I already have 2, so I'm just going to add 4. 1 second, take a quick drink. Thank you guys very much. All right, so now I would like to actually define my stimuli. So I want to present the participants with 3 words and 3 non-words. So I'm just going to make them up. I'll do dog. Dog is my word. I'll do cat, and I'll do cow. Why not? As my 3 words. And then for my non-words, I'm just going to make random button presses, honestly. There we go. Those are my non-words. I'm not even going to try to pronounce them. So now that I have all the stimuli that I want to present to participants, if you remember from my instruction screen, which I'm going to jump back to, you don't have to follow along, on the instruction screen here, I said if the stimulus is a word, press 1. If it's a non-word, press 2. So this means that each of these trials has an associated correct response, and I want to pair those. So for example, when dog appears on the screen, that's clearly a word, participants are only supposed to press 1 to that. If they press 2, that's incorrect. So in order to pair things like this, so to pair a stimuli with a correct response, or to pair a stimuli with a stim type or something like that, all I would do is create another attribute immediately next to it. Because the way that ePrime views a trial in these list objects is per row. So each row is considered a trial, and all of the data held within each row of this list object is considered one trial in E prime. So if I go ahead and make another attribute here called correct response, and click add, anything I put here will be immediately associated with whatever's next to it. So in this instance, correct response will be 1 for all of my words, and they will be 2 for my non-words. Now, I just started typing out 1. If you want to be lazy, what you can do, or if you have a lot of these that you need to fill in, I did not mean to type K there. If you have a lot of these that you need to fill in and you don't feel like typing 1, enter for a day and a half, all you have to do is take the little cursor, drag it to the fill handle in the bottom right-hand corner, and just drag and drop. And what that'll do is that'll fill in everything beneath it. That's what I did for 2. You also have the option to copy and paste, so you can select whatever you want, hit Control-C, select whatever you want to change, hit Control-V, and it'll change. It also works if you do Control-Z. I did Control-Z, and it undid my changes. So it's pretty nice like that. So now that I have my stimuli and my correct response, I'm going to add another variable to this list object that's not going to be actively used in the experiment object, but in the experiment while it's running. But it is going to be used to help my data at the end of it. It'll kind of make it easier for me to analyze this data. So if I click on this, it'll say add attribute, and the attribute that I'm going to change is actually going to be stim type. And this is going to let me know if the stimulus is a word or a non-word. My little hypothesis for this experiment is that participants are more likely to respond faster to a word than to a non-word, hence the lexical decision that they're making. So this will let me calculate the RT values by this stim type instead of having to pick through each of the stimuli that they were presented and determine the stim type that way, and even make a new column in my data file, which is possible, but it takes a while. This will just do that automatically for me. So my stim type, I'm going to say word, obviously, for my 3 words, and that's just me typing and then doing copy and paste. And then for non-word, or all the rest are just going to be non-words. And again, I'll just do copy and paste, Control-C and Control-V. So now that I have all of my independent variables set up, I have the 2 that I'm going to use during the experiment, and I have 1 that I'm going to use for data analysis later. There's something that I need to change about this. If you look at the selection method up here, it says sequential selection. So every participant is going to receive dog, cat, cow, and then my 3 non-words in exactly that order. And that's something participants might catch on to. If they know that there's only 6 trials and they've already seen 3 words, then they're probably going to know that the last 3 are non-words and they're going to be responding much faster, and that's not ideal. So what I want to do is I would like to change my selection method here from sequential, obviously, to random. So if I go ahead and click on the properties page up here and click on selection, what I can do is set the order. Right now, I'm just going to set it to random. What random does is it'll select an item from the list randomly using a random seed that we define in E prime. It'll randomly select an item from the list, and then once it's been selected, it'll never select that item again until the list cycles through again, which it's not doing because we haven't specified it to. Random with replacement, however, is if it selects a word, it'll randomly have the opportunity to select that word again. So if I set random with replacement, there is an instance, very small chance, but there is a chance that E prime will randomly select the word dog 6 times. That's just how random with replacement works. But since I want all of my stimuli, especially since I took so long to type them out, to show up, I want to change my order from sequential to random. Now, if you guys would like an overview of what the other ones, order properties are, please let me know in the comments. I'd be happy to let you know. But for now, we're just going to stick with random. I'm going to click OK to keep that change, and now it says random selection. So now E prime will randomly select from each one of these rows. All of the data will be maintained per row. So there's never going to be an instance, for example, where dog is lined up with a correct response of 2, or where cat's lined up with a correct response of 2, or this random series of letters I typed lines up with correct response 1. E prime is going to keep these 3 together, and it'll keep these 3 together because it logs everything per row. So now that I have all my independent variables set, the next thing I want to do is actually just set up what the participants are going to see. If you remember from my instruction screen, I'm just going to flip to it, you don't have to yet. If you remember from my instruction screen, it says you will be presented with a fixation followed by a stimuli. My fixation is literally just going to be a little plus sign in the middle of the screen just so they know where to look. So there isn't that extra added time to the reaction time for when they actually try to find the object on the screen. Since reaction time is my most important dependent variable here. So since it's just going to be a little plus sign on the screen, all I really need to do is just add a text display object. The text display object in this instance is just going to be called fixation. And Kate, I did it again.
I know you did.
Sorry about that.
That's okay. Interlude with IT guy. Back to E prime.
Perfect. Thank you, guys. So now for real, to rename it, I'm going to right-click on it, and I'm going to click F2 instead of actually clicking F2 on the keyboard. Again, new software. Thanks for bearing with us. I'm going to change our text display 1 here from text display 1 to fixation, since the purpose of this object is going to be to display fixation. So I'm going to go ahead and double-click on it to open it in eStudio, or in the workspace here, and all I'm going to do is just add a plus sign to it. There we go. So now that I've added a plus sign to this, what you're going to notice is that it shows up at the very top of the screen instead of the center. If I click on the properties page here, you'll see that these properties, align horizontal and align vertical, are all set to center and center. What this means is that when this runs in E prime during the runtime, it's actually going to show up in the center of the screen, despite looking like it's at the top right now. So even though it shows up at the top, it's mostly just for editing purposes, just so you can see everything without having to kind of scroll on the right here. It's just important to know that, just take a look at the line horizontal and line vertical properties, and that's going to be exactly what you need. I'm going to take a look at the duration input tab very briefly. 1,000 milliseconds is fine. It might be a little excessive. I'll change this to 500 milliseconds. And for data logging, as always, I'm going to put time on it only on. Pre-release is also going to be important. What pre-release does is pre-release allows you to preload the next object in an experimental timeline while this one's already on the screen. So if I set pre-release in this instance the same as duration, what's going to happen is this object's going to appear on the screen, and then EEPRIME's immediately going to stop processing it. It'll still stay on the screen for the entire duration, but EEPRIME won't be processing it while it's on the screen. It'll actually be spending all of those 500 milliseconds loading the next object on the screen. Pre-release is particularly important if you have any videos or images or audio clips. Again, the cold. If you have any audio clips that you're presenting to participants, that way it has more than enough time to play, or more than enough time to load before it plays, so you don't have as many onset delays, and things show up in to participants as quickly as possible. So I'm going to go ahead and click Apply and OK, because that's exactly what I need here. Give me a sec to take another sip of water. Perfect. All right, so I'm done with my fixation. That's honestly all I need. So the next thing I want to add to my trial proc timeline here is the actual stimuli that participants are going to see. In this instance, I am going to use a slide object again. It's completely acceptable to use a text display object. That's completely fine. I'm just going to add a slide object. So my slide object, again, is called slide 1. I'm going to rename it, again, without crashing this time. I'm going to rename it to stim display. I'm just going to edit the properties of my stim display quickly. Again, we've been working with slide objects almost the entire time. They're pretty easy. I'm going to add this text display object here since my stimuli is text-based. I'm going to add it to the middle of the slide here, but I'll figure out if it's actually the middle in a second. And if I go ahead and delete the text on it and just click on the left square bracket, EEPRIME is going to pop up with something called a TrimSense. What this does is it will look through all of your lists and through all of your inline objects if you're writing script through inline objects, and it's going to look for all of the attributes that you've defined in EEPRIME. An attribute in EEPRIME is those columns, those column headings that we made in that trial list, and it's going to let you know which ones are available to be referenced. In this instance, I kept all of my independent variables relating to the stimuli under an attribute called stimuli. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that. And what it does is it essentially makes a completely formatted attribute reference for you. The way that we reference attributes in EEPRIME and say, hey, EEPRIME, use this later, is just surround the name of the attribute in square brackets. And that's exactly what it's done for us. So now, whenever this slide appears to participants, it's not going to show the word stimuli. it's actually going to show whatever's in trial proc here. So it'll show dog, cat, cow, and my 3 non-words. It'll actually show those randomly because we told ePrime to randomly show those. So it's basically like a placeholder in ePrime, if you want to think of it that way. A placeholder for the more important independent variables. And like I mentioned earlier, I want to make sure this shows up exactly where my fixation does in the middle of the screen. So if I click on this text subobject, click on the subobject properties page, and click on the frame tab here, I want to change the X and Y position. I'm going to change them from their current state, which is kind of close to the middle, to the actual middle. So I'll change my X and Y to center and center, click apply and OK, and now it is in the middle of the screen exactly how I like it. The only other thing that I have to change now is those duration input properties again. Because right now they're set to only show this for 1,000 milliseconds, and it's set to not be able to respond, but participants, if you remember, have to press either 1 or 2 on the keyboard. So I'll click on the properties page up here, click on the duration input tab. I'm going to change the duration to 5,000 milliseconds, so they have 5 seconds to respond to this. I'm going to add a keyboard input mask, which means that participants can respond to the keyboard at this point. And I'm going to change the allowable from any, because I don't want them to just mash the keyboard. That wouldn't work well. I want them to respond either using the 1 or 2 keys and want to restrict access to all other keys. So if they press the space bar, if they press anything else, ePrime's not going to accept that response. It will only accept a 1 or a 2. So you just change that from nothing to 1, 2. There's no need to put a comma in between or a space in between. If you just put 1, 2, that means ePrime is counting either 1 or 2 as a correct response and not 12. And then I'm going to make another attribute reference, which is like what we made here for our stimuli, but this time it's going to be for that correct answer attribute that we made in our trial list. So if you do a square bracket, type correct answer, and do another square bracket, you're going to see that ePrime turns this blue. What that means for ePrime, or for you, is that ePrime says, hey, this is temporary. Correct answer, or the words correct answer isn't actually going to be the correct response. I'm going to look somewhere else in the experiment for this. And since our trial list is technically in this experiment structure here above the stim display, that's where it's going to look for it. And I'm going to change our data logging here. What ePrime does, it does something new that would have been really helpful for me as an undergraduate, is it actually prompts you. It says if you set a correct response but didn't turn data logging on, you're probably going to lose some data like I did. And it says, do you want to actually turn on data logging and set it to standard? Since that's what I was going to do anyway, I'm going to click yes. And it'll change it to standard for me. I can click apply and OK. And I'm done. That's all I need to do for this slide. Now it's going to show up, or show all of these words and non-words. It's going to have the associated correct response. And in my data file, I'm going to be even able to parse whether it was a word or non-word presented per trial. Now the last thing I want to do is I want to give participants visual feedback. So, did they respond correctly or incorrectly? And for those of you who are new to ePrime, this isn't going to be as funny for you. But for those of you who used ePrime 2, we now changed our feedback display from a check mark to a thumbs up and a thumbs down. I personally love it. So what you do is you just drag a feedback display object after the slide object, put it right after stim display. Honestly, feedback display 1 is as descriptive as it needs to be. If you really would like a more concise name, I would recommend just naming this feedback. And then if you double click on it, it's going to look really familiar if you guys have used slide objects before. All these are just pre-rendered slide objects. So they're slide objects with different what we call slide states at the bottom here. So this will appear if participants respond correctly. This will appear if they respond incorrectly. If participants don't respond in those 500 milliseconds, or 5,000 milliseconds, sorry, 5 seconds, no response is going to show up here. And pending is going to show up. The way that we have it set up, pending actually isn't going to show up. That's for very special circumstances. But these are just pre-formatted slide objects. You can change these however you want. So if you want correct to be great job, or if you want incorrect to be a little less harsh and be something like you'll get it next time, you can totally do that. You can add buttons, you can add slide text, you can add movies. This is one of the easier ways to do response contingent or accuracy contingent paradigms in eStudio, is just through these slide objects here, or these feedback objects. Now the only property we really need to change about this feedback object is this properties page here. You'll see that there's something called input object name in the general tab. Now what the input object name does is it actually lets you point e' at the object to which you're going to give feedback. So for example, if I click on here, I'm going to see all of my instructions here. Clearly, I don't want participants to get feedback based on how they did on the fixation slide or to the demographic instructions. I want them to receive feedback based on how they responded to the stimulus display. So go ahead and click on Stim Display and click Apply and OK, and that's all you have to change. Now E' will automatically, and I want to just line this up because I'm me, E' is going to automatically log and show feedback for the Stim Display object on this feedback object. It'll cycle through all of these slide tabs, or all these slide states with these tabs down here. It'll cycle through these based on participants' response, and there's really no work that you have to do, which is honestly what I like. So now I have my trial procedure already set up. Participants are going to see feedback or fixation, they're going to see Stim Display, they're going to see feedback. That's really all they need. The only thing I want to add to this is just a satisfaction rating at the end to show you guys how the slider works, and then just make that my goodbye slide. So if I jump back to my session proc, this is still my experimental timeline. And I told you guys that the session level is really for the entire session of the experiment. So from when they sit down to when they stand up. If you take a look at this, these are the demographic instructions that we made. These are the real instructions that we made for the actual task. And then we have our block list. Now the block list, if you look at our structure window here, actually contains everything that we made. So this is, E' is going to basically sit and spin on this for 6 trials. Now I'm actually going to close all these windows because they're bothering me. There we go. So E' will sit and spin on here for all 6 trials. Once it's done with all the 6 trials, it's going to move on to everything after it. And what I'm going to put after it is our goodbye slide. So I'm going to take this slide object, I'm going to drag it and drop it to the very end, and I'm going to rename it to goodbye. Now what I want to do on the goodbye slide is not only say goodbye, but I want to rate the participant satisfaction with this experiment. I know that's not a thing you do. It's just a nice contrived way to show you how to use a slider. So I would go into my slide layout templates, and I'm going to scroll down here, and I'm going to get to a 10-point show value all label text prompt. So I'm going to click on that, and similarly to when we did a demo collect there, it's going to draw onto the screen a slider. Here you go. A slide slider with a survey header, a question instructions, question prompt, and a next button. There's some properties I want to change, but they're pretty easy to change. The most important thing though is now we have a fully functional slide slider with a 1 to 10 scale, and this 1 at the top is going to change based on what item they're clicking or what item they're on when they're running at E'. So the survey header is just going to be goodbye question. My instruction will be rate your satisfaction with this experiment using the provided slider, and the question prompt will be fraction of 1 means you were not a little wordy, but we'll resize and move some of these things so participants can actually see them when they run the experiment. There we go, and that's going to look a little better when it runs too. So I have rate your satisfaction with this experiment using the provided slider. A satisfaction of 1 means you were not at all satisfied with this experiment. A satisfaction rating of 10 means that you were extremely satisfied with this experiment. And I think my word experiment, there we go. Got cut off. There's my slider, and my next button is going to go in the bottom right-hand corner there. And again, I'm going to change the text on my next to just end. Or I will type experiment end is going to be the name. So that's going to be my rest property. And then under my theme, I'm going to change the text to just to end there. So now participants know that if they click this button, that's going to ostensibly end the experiment. And if I look at my duration input tab again, you'll see that now my input source is related to this slider, So I'm not actually determining when they click on that button. And my duration input tab is already set up to select or to be ready for participants to hit that button and to end the slide after they've clicked that. So now if you run this, you can actually, you'll see that this slider is going to move based on participant click, and that they're going to click end to end the experiment. So just a pretty easy way to make a slider in ePrime. Now, like I said earlier, I want to make a practice block of trials. I want to have a 2-block experiment, because right now what it does, and I'm going to click save to save this quick, what it does is it'll just run through one set of trials, and what you're going to see in this obviously is a learning curve. Participants are learning where the 1 and 2 buttons are. They're going to respond to the first couple stimuli much slower than they would the rest of them, and that's not ideal. So what I could do is I could spend a really long time in a lot of YouTube stream just adding more objects and going over everything I already went over, and honestly it's going to be boring for both you and me. There is a much faster and easier way to do this. So to make an entirely new block, in this instance a practice block, let's go ahead and click on our block list, and we will add a new level. Now I have it set at block proc as default, but I'm going to change this from block proc to practice. So it'll say practice block proc. It doesn't exist, so I'd like to create it, so I'm going to click yes. And as you see, I now have a practice block proc. But my practice block proc happens after my critical trials, and that's not ideal. So if you would ever like to reorder blocks or basically levels of your experiment, all you do is click on the ID column here, and then just move it up. And there's going to be a little red line that'll tell you exactly where it's going to appear. I want it to appear above 1, so I click on that, and it's going to appear there. Now, if it doesn't appear like it's changing in this structure window here, all you have to do is click F5 to refresh. And as you can see now, it jumped up, and I definitely messed up the stream again. And I'm back. There we go. So if you click F5, it'll just reorder the experiment structure window. Again, it's also a hotkey in our new program. So as long as you're not running OBS, you're fine. So now with our practice block proc set up, all I have to do is just copy and paste these objects. So I'm going to take this list object and I'm going to copy it. You can either use Control-C or right-click and click copy, and then go ahead and open your practice block proc, and click paste. Now what it's going to tell me is that the object that I'm pasting contains child objects. In this instance, child objects refers to fixation, stim display, feedback. Would I also like to paste those? If I click yes, what it's going to do is it's going to create new instances of those objects, and they're going to be called fixation 1, stim display 1, feedback 1. That's completely unnecessary in this instance because they're going to be doing the same thing that fixation, stim display, and feedback are already doing. So if I click no, look at what happens. If I open this all down, it's still referencing these objects because they're a part of the procedure, but it's just referencing the same instance of each object. So for example, I'm going to change fixation on the practice procedure. So instead of a plus sign, I'll change it to my name. Now if I hop down to my block proc and click on it, it's also Devon. It's just referencing one object in 2 different places. So if you need any of these things to change between procedures, I do recommend pasting the child objects and clicking yes to that. I click no, so now it's just referencing the same objects in 2 places. So I will change that back to my plus sign. And the only thing I need to change would be this trial list 1 now. I'm going to rename this from trial list 1 to prac trial list. And then at that point, I can change my stimuli. So instead of all 6, I'm just going to present participants with 2. To delete it, all you do is just highlight the rows you want to delete, click yes, and then change the stimuli. So I'll make them different. That's actually the same. And then this is obviously a non-word. There we go. So that's how you make a practice procedure. Pretty easy. This also demonstrates what ePrime means by blocks. So an entire block of trials for practice, an entire block of trials for the actual trial list. So hopefully that makes the the whole block, the whole session block and trial level mean a little bit more now that we have multiple blocks in the experiment. So that's really all I have as far as experiment creation is concerned. There are a couple of nice little properties that I want to show you guys quickly before we end the stream. The one that I want to show you guys that's new to e'Prime3 specifically is called windowed mode. And you get there either by clicking on erun test and it'll bring up this same dialog, or if you click on windowed mode here, it'll bring up that same dialog with this run experiment in windowed mode check mark already checked. What that allows you to do is instead of having e'Prime take over your entire screen when it runs, it actually just runs e'Prime in a little window that you can move around whenever you want, basically. This also allows you to input different attributes and different properties into your experiment whenever it runs. It actually opens up a secondary e'Prime window that allows you to interact with the experiment while it's running. We also have something called Quick Start, which is essentially just a run from here. So if there's anything about this experiment that I don't want to run because I know runs, let's say I really just want to make sure the goodbye slide works. I don't have to run through my entire experiment. All I do is uncheck the objects I don't want to run and literally just run my goodbye slide. There's also the option of what we call interactive lists. An interactive list here allows us to, what it'll do is it'll run the experiment up until this point, as long as I have these selected. Then, once it gets to this list object, it'll allow me to select what aspects of that list object I want to run. So let's say, for instance, I only want to test that my practice block proc works. I don't care that my critical trials work. I've run them before. I know that it works. I just want to make sure my practice trials work. It'll get to this list object. It'll stop you. It'll open up a window and it'll say, what levels do you want to run and what levels do you not want to run? And all I'll say is, I want to run my practice block, and it'll just run the practice block. It's pretty handy if you're debugging your experiment. It lets you kind of narrow in on some of the specific problems in your experiment and places that might be problems later. It lets you kind of get past all of the parts are working well, just to focus on the parts that might not be. So it's just a useful feature in e'Prime. The only other thing I want to talk about is in data file, or the data file tab here. I know I had this open before, but one of my favorite properties is this one right here. It's create a tab delimited copy of the data file. What this allows you to do is, instead of having to take your experiment in eData8 and transferring it to other experiments or other software, it allows you to just make a tab delimited copy of the data file already, and you can port that into other software pretty easily. And it does that for you automatically without you having to do any work in the front end. So honestly, that's all I have for the live stream today. I didn't see too many comments in the chat. If you guys would like to ask me questions, I'm definitely available for questions. Let me know in the next couple of minutes. I'd be happy to take any questions if you guys have any. Otherwise, thank you guys so much for coming. Again, thank you guys for putting up with my slowly deteriorating voice because of my head cold. And thank you again for all bearing with the technical difficulties in the learning curve here. I hope it was a lot of fun for me. I hope you guys had fun too.
You could run the experiment.
Yeah.
If there do not have any questions.
Yeah, if you guys don't have any questions too, I'm just going to run the experiment quick just to show you guys.
And it'll show up on the Devon, just right there.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm actually going to disable. Yeah, I'm going to disable window or disable that there, and I'm going to click test. There you go. So this is that alternate screen that I was talking about. It'll give me my kind of subject and session. I'm going to actually. It allows me just to click exit there. If I do that, it'll stop my experiment for me. I'm going to test this, and I'm actually going to produce a data file. There. So this is my experiment running in windowed mode. So, welcome to your experiment. This is the demographic information. Click continue. How many of these paradigms have I made? I've made all of them. So I'm going to go ahead and click all of them. Go ahead and click space to continue. And so if I look here, I actually got an error. It says for stim display input mask, it says there's no such attribute called correct answer. And if I hop into here, there's correct answer. And if I look into my trial list object, it's called correct response. So this is a really nice way that a windowed mode helps you to kind of catch these errors pretty quickly instead of having to go back and, watch your experiment kind of fall apart in front of your eyes. So I'll change my correct to correct response here, and I'm going to do the same thing. I made that change here so I don't have to make it to my stim display here. So if I run it now, it should run without issue. There we go. And if you notice in the background here, it's actually collecting all of the data and showing you the data that's being collected in real time. So I can hop back to this here. It'll show you the script that's being run at this time too. And then this is the context. This is actually what's happening. So I'm going to start to make some responses. So if you look over here, if I want to see what button I pressed, demo instructions here, demo instructions.resp is continue. So this is a nice way for me to kind of debug and troubleshoot the data that I'm going to get from the data file on the fly. So I'm going to select all of these, click next, press my space bar to continue. There's that fixation. There's that. There's my non-word, respond correctly to these. And now these are my critical trials. I'll get one wrong just to show you. There we go. So that's my incorrect feedback. There you go. And then this is that slider that I made earlier. It allows me to collect my satisfaction ratings. So if I want to select, I was extremely satisfied with this experiment, I will select 10 here. And then I'll click end. And I also may not have set up that end button correctly, but that's okay. So what that allows me to do then is if I ever get stuck like this, instead of having to click Control-Alt-Shift or Control-Alt-Delete, the benefit actually of experiment windowed mode here is I can just click either exit or abort, and it'll just stop the experiment on the fly like that. It'll say, would you like to abort experiment? Yes. I don't have to remember any complicated key sequences. It just lets you literally just click on that abort button at the top. And what I've done here is it's actually created that tab delimited text version of my file for me anyway. So it's actually just a really nice feature running in that windowed mode. I like it. It does a really good job of kind of safeguarding against anything going wrong in your experiment. And it's just a really good way to kind of test and debug the experiment too. So I think that's all I have for the live stream today.
For sure.
Yeah, thank you guys so much for coming. If you have any questions, please feel free to email PST support. Just support@pstnet.com. I would be happy to answer any of your guys' questions. Again, thank you guys so much for attending. Have a great day.